Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to give a couple minutes for everyone else to get settled, but once we have that going, we'll be ready to start. Just a reminder, if you haven't already set up your questions or sent them in, we're taking them, and the sooner we get them, the higher the priority date will be. All right, now that we've given everyone a chance to get settled, we're ready to get started. Welcome to Ask the Expert, everyone. As you know, my name is John L. Agabon. I'm a business development executive here at Burdock Group. And before we get started, I'd like to give an introduction of the event and a little background on Burdock Group itself. As many of you know, Burdock Group is an ingredient safety and regulatory firm that has been helping food, dietary supplement, and animal feed companies overcome the regulatory obstacles to bring their ingredients to market. Over the past 30 years, we've helped clients with label reviews, claims guidance, safety assessments, study protocol reviews and management, risk assessments, as well as NDINs, FAPs, and of course, GRAS. This afternoon's event is a live Q&A where you will get the opportunity to receive answers to your unique questions. Thank you to those of you who already sent your questions. We appreciate them. And to those who have yet to send them, we look forward to receiving them. And as always, if we can't get to your question today, we are going to make an effort to answer them after the event. And if you have any questions outside of this event, please feel free to reach out to info@burdockgroup.com and we will reach out to you as soon as possible. Okay, today's guest is a person that doesn't need an introduction to any of you all. In fact, you may recognize him as the tall guy at the IFT booth or at one of his many talks. Our guest earned his doctorate in toxicology from the University of Mississippi, has over 30 years of experience advising clients regarding ingredient safety and regulatory affairs, published 3 books, and has over 40 publications in scientific journals. It's a great privilege and honor to welcome our founder, president, and principal consultant, Dr. George Burdock.
Thank you, John L. My name is George Burdock. John L's right. And I'd like to talk today about medical foods and foods for special dietary use. But first, let me satisfy the lawyers and read this disclaimer. Concepts and examples discussed in this lecture are for illustrative purposes only and do not constitute safety or regulatory advice. The examples provided herein may not apply to your specific situation. Please contact us for an analysis of your particular circumstance to determine the best pathway for your product and team. Let's start off with milestones in medical foods. This is the order in which things happen, and medical foods regulation evolved with time. So the order in which things happen is important. History is always a good teacher of what's going to happen next. In 1958, lefenolac was produced by Mead Johnson for PKU patients, that is, children and adults that have phenylketonuria. It was approved as a drug. The PKU people cannot metabolize phenylalanine, and even though it's an essential amino acid, if they can't metabolize it, certain toxic substances are derived from phenylalanine, and it has severe consequences. Anyway, this, as approved as a drug, was only available by prescription. Now, in 1966, there was creation of the category Foods for Special Dietary Uses, and it was in 21 CFR 125 at that time. But later on, it changed the CFR number. At this time, though, in '66, it was specified, it specified explicit label statements for vitamins and minerals, infant food, which later became another category, food for use in reducing, maintaining, or gaining body weight, the diets of diabetics, hyperallergenic food, and low sodium foods. In 1972, just a few years later, lefenilec was transferred from the drugs category to the food for special dietary use for a couple of reasons. This transfer didn't require then that a prescription be gotten for PKU. There was a subsequent price drop, and people could pick it up in specialty food stores, drug stores, and still at the doctor's office if they wanted to. In 1977, when the CFR was totally reformed, foods for special dietary use went to 21 CFR 105.3. Now, it was also expanded a little bit and included foods which served needs including physiologic, pathologic, and other conditions, which is a pretty broad category, including conditions of disease, convalescence, pregnancy, lactation, allergy, underweight, overweight, needs existing by reasons of age, including infancy or other special needs. And as I said earlier, this category for infancy was later moved over into infant foods. This category has not been eliminated by regulation, although some of these parts of it, like infant foods and medical foods, have been carved out of it. I don't know if FDA will ever try to get rid of this regulation because it does serve some purposes, or it still does. In 1988, the Orphan Drugs Act was passed. Now, this was a policy passed by Congress, signed into law by the president, that allowed a compassionate development of drugs for rare diseases or orphan diseases. And these were diseases that had, I think it's less than 1 in 100,000 people who had that problem. And it wouldn't be a successful or monetary returning drug. That is, it had not much ROI on it. But FDA allowed certain concessions and incentives for people that fulfill the mandate of developing orphan drugs and foods for certain diseases. In 1990, the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, the NLEA, made some special rules for medical foods. It exempted them from nutrition labeling, a health claim prior to approval requirements. That is, they didn't have to prove that the medical food did a certain thing. And there was a waiver for nutrient content claim requirements applicable to conventional foods. Obviously, because a lot of these medical foods didn't have some element in them that could be normally found in foods. In 1993, medical foods were defined in 21 CFR 101.9J8, and it remains in this place today. In 2013, there was guidance for clinical investigators, sponsors, and so on, who thought that proving a claim for a medical food might make them a drug. So there was a special exemption for conducting these clinical studies. In 2016, there was a guidance that came out for industry called FAQs about medical foods, second edition. But this really represents kind of an end run about at least a couple of court decisions saying that you can't enforce regulation or you can't use guidelines as regulation. Now, President Trump last year signed a couple of executive orders that specifically forbid using guidelines or FAQs as sort of extra regulation or rump regulation. Whether FDA follows through with that, this mandate, is unsure at this time. Although Trump intends, or the president intends, I'm told, to make these executive orders into regulations so they can't be changed by the next president, should that next president decide to revoke these executive orders. Now, in the Orphan Drug Act, it defines under Section 3 the term medical food means a food which is formulated to be consumed or administered enterally under the supervision of a physician and which is intended for the specific dietary management of a disease or condition which is has distinctive nutritional requirements based on recognized scientific principles and established by medical evaluation. So there's two purposes here. It has to be fed enterally and not parenterally. Parental nutrition still is a drug and must go through the drug approval process. For the enteral feeding, that would be like a nasogastric tube or direct gastric intubation of, and for a nasogastric tube, it might, or direct gastric intubation would be for somebody such as having esophageal atresia, which is common. People try to gulp down red hot clam chowder or something, and it essentially causes a burn that closes off the esophagus. So the nasogastric tube or direct intubation into the stomach is used as a medical food. Also, the other provision here is for people that have a digestion problem such as achlorhydria, where there's no acid in the stomach to promote digestion, or people that can't absorb certain things, or that have a specific need, such as people with phenylketonuria, which can't have much phenylalanine in their diet. Now, what's this? These FAQs, FDA put some very, I'd say, onerous restrictions. They say after the medical food definition, it's sort of like FDA put in this list of things like, well, FDA, a medical food is the following only if it is a specially formulated and processed product, not just a common food, and must be available orally or via enteral feeding tube. That is, if somebody just can't swallow or can't take a food orally, you can't stick a meal in a blender, puree it, and call that a medical food. FDA says it is intended, that is the medical food, intended for dietary management of a patient who has limited or impaired capacity to digest or has special medically determined nutrient requirements that cannot be achieved by modification of the normal diet alone, right? That makes sense. It provides nutritional support for unique nutrient needs, the result from a specific disease or condition as determined by a medical evaluation. That makes sense. It is intended only for a patient that requires medical care on a recurring basis for, among other things, instructions on the use of the medical food. So that carries through with the original law that says physician intervention is required. Now, why the individual, say a PKU patient, would need instructions on a weekly basis as to why he needs to still take this diet is a little bit beyond me. The physician just says, do what you did last week. Now, foods for special dietary use. This regulation preceded the medical foods category, and it's very loosey-goosey, as you can see. It's for use for particular dietary needs, physical, physiological, pathological, or other condition, which is not defined, including but not limited to the conditions of diseases, convalescence, pregnancy, lactation, allergic hypersensitivity to food, underweight, and overweight. Now, there's several pathological conditions that could require something like this, like burn patients need hypercaloric diets. But this still wouldn't be a medical food because a hypercaloric diet might be something that just had more fats added to it, or the individual is just getting more volume. Uses, and it goes on here to say that uses for supplying particular dietary needs which exist by reason of age, including but not limited to the ages of infancy and childhood. So infant foods were pulled out of this, although it still could be a food for special dietary use. But again, there may be specific conditions requiring this for infants or kids. It's also used for supplementing or fortifying the ordinary or usual diet with any vitamin, mineral, or other dietary properties, such as more calories. And obviously, this was written long before dietary supplements came along, because vitamins and minerals that may be needed to supplement the diet are readily available as dietary supplements. Any such particular use of a food is a special dietary use, regardless of whether such food also purports to be or is represented for general use. That is, the material can also be, the food could be used for general use. Now, getting down to medical foods versus foods for special dietary use. In the medical food side, it's specific that this is not a drug. It can't have an RX symbol on it, and it can't have a national drug code number. Foods for special dietary use, the same applies. Medical foods are exempted from the NLEA labeling requirements for nutrient or health claims. Foods for special dietary use are a little bit different. They're exempted under certain circumstances, such as low volume production. Medical foods and foods for special dietary use may contain approved colors, food additives, or GRAS substances. Medical foods are restricted to persons who cannot swallow, absorb, digest, or digest food, or those born with an inborn error of metabolism, such as PKU patients. Under foods for special dietary use, people with inborn errors of metabolism or persons who cannot swallow or digest food would be included here, but it could also be a medical food. Or it could be a hypercaloric food for burn victims. For medical foods in general, it does not pertain to persons who can address the problem by nutrient supplementation or reasonably obtained abstinence, such as carbohydrates by diabetics. Under foods for special dietary use, this includes hypoallergenic foods, high or low caloric foods, physiological or pathologic or other conditions, pregnancy, lactation, and even non-nutritive food, such as foods with non-nutritive sweeteners. So looking at it one-to-one, that's a good comparison between medical foods and foods for special dietary use. All right, that's about it. We can open the floor up for questions.
Fantastic. I don't know if anyone else still has questions after that, but I know a lot of mine were answered. Thank you, Dr. Burdock, for the good overview and good comparison. Now, as a reminder to everyone, before we move forward with questions, we're looking forward to receiving some of your questions, and we're ready to add them to our list. And also, slides will be available upon request, and we will send them to you if you reach out to us. All right. Anything else, Dr. Burdock? We're ready to get started.
All right, well, I've got this cheat sheet here. Do you want me to go over that first? We had some questions submitted in advance. And so we can go through these and wait for the other questions to come in.
Absolutely. So let me get started with the first question, Dr. Burdock. Can you provide some examples of foods that fit into the definition of a medical food / food for special dietary use? Additionally, are there any examples of dietary supplements that fit into this category?
Well, for foods for special dietary use, I talked about hypercaloric foods, foods with extra vitamins and minerals, nearly any food ingredient that supplements in the nutritive category, or a dietary food with fewer calories. So it could be a diet food or hypercaloric food would be something for food for special dietary use. Medical foods would be something like for PKU patients, which have lower phenylalanine content. You can't go out there at the grocery store and pick low phenylalanine foods because they're just not available. And phenylalanine occurs in not just meat or dairy products, but a lot of vegetables as well. So it would be very, very hard to titrate how much phenylalanine an individual is getting. It would be much more difficult than counting sugar equivalents for diabetics. Now, are there other medical foods? There's one where I think it's called maple syrup disease, where individuals can't ingest branched amino acids. So this would be like PKU in that they have to have foods formulated that don't have these branched chain amino acids. For foods for special dietary use, the category is so wide open, most anything could fit in there. So it would be up to you to decide what, or to define this. A question about dietary supplements. Can dietary supplements added to food? No, you can't add dietary supplements to food. That's in section 912 of the Food Additive Amendment Act of 2007. What is the path to market for medical foods? Do they have to be provided directly by a physician? Are they held in pharmacies? Or can they be sold on a regular store shelf? Or can they be sold online? The FDA would like to see them sold in pharmacies or specialty food stores, but they started appearing online several years ago, and FDA really hasn't been able to do anything about it. I don't see how they could. Some physicians can sell them out of their offices. I'm not sure if that would really be worth it. The only advantage here is that if this was reimbursable by Medicaid or Medicare, then it would be probably advantageous for the doctor to sell it out of his office. If people bought it normally at the drugstore, would they get reimbursement? It would probably be a little bit more difficult. How can a company get medical foods designation for its product? Is it a registration process? Well, yes and no. If you grass a food or have a food additive, you want to sell it as a medical food, you make that statement in your notification or in your food additive petition, and it will be reviewed by the Office of ONPLOTS, which is the Office of Product Labeling, Nutrition, and Dietary Supplements. They will probably ask you a few questions about the product. Can you verify if a food has received a medical foods designation from the FDA? Good question. FDA does not maintain a list of medical foods. You'd have to go through the grasses to find out if a material is a medical food or has been not objected to as a medical food.
Dr. Burdock, do you mind if I ask a question?
Sure.
So when you're looking through these grasses, does it have to specify that it's grass as a medical food within the grass?
Right. It's going to have to say we're grassing this as medical food. It could be also grass for other purposes, for non-medical food purposes. Okay. They would, in theory, have to list the categories. It could be for use as a medical food. It has a higher or lower amount than used by consumers through the normal grass process.
Okay, that's good to know. Well, moving on. You have a few more tack.
Can a medical food be used to address a symptom of a disease with a distinct nutritional requirements without specifically targeting the nutritional deficiency? That is, disease A causes difficulty metabolizing nutrient B, which causes diarrhea. A medical food improves the diarrhea in the disease population, but the mechanism of whether metabolizing nutrient B has improved is unknown. Kind of convoluted here, and there's several questions. But if you have a substance that helps the metabolism of another substance, well-powered study be sufficient or additional studies always warranted. In theory, a clinical study is not required under the medical food regulation. However, it's probably fairly certain that the Office of ONPLOTS, the Office of Labeling, is going to ask for some sort of substantiation that your material works. My understanding which could be wrong, that's all right too, is that if I have a medical food, it must be used on the direction of a health professional, and I can't label restrictions. But if I have food for special dietary use, it can be sold at retail, and I can label for restrictions. Do I have that right? If so, why does that make sense? Why can't I label a medical food with restricted uses? It depends on what the restriction is. A medical food, like a food for special dietary use, must comply with other regulations. It's got to be safe, for one thing. If it has potential to trigger an allergy, like it might have tree nuts in it, or shellfish, or fish, or any of the other constituents that are known to trigger an allergic reaction, that yes, you'd have to label it for that restriction. If it had gluten in it, even though that isn't under the Allergy Act, FALPA, you would have to say that it's got gluten in it. So I don't see where you couldn't put restrictions on it. But again, it depends on the type of restriction you're talking about.
I'd like to pause there, Dr. Burdock. I think we went through most of the pre-submitted questions, and we do have a few more that came. So let's get into some of those. So the first one I'd like to tackle is, well, after a Coke break. You deserve it.
Thank you.
We went through that in record time. I think that was the fastest we've ever answered 9 questions in these segments. So, all right, we do have a lot of follow-up questions. So this one's the first one I'm going to ask is, please clarify. Can an ingredient only be GRAS for intended use of medical foods? I think you touched on this earlier, but this individual wants to revisit that subject.
Yes. You could GRAS it and say that this is restricted to medical use only, or medical food only, instead of saying, well, we're going to GRAS this and it could be used in this category, that category for the particular list of uses. Or you could say medical foods only as, say, a nutrient or antioxidant.
Now, when you talk about these categories, what do you, I mean, how do you distinguish? I mean, you talk about consumption categories for medical foods?
There's a medical food. Well, a medical food is usually a liquid. Probably 99% of them are. I can't think of one that isn't. But it in the foods category, in the food categories, where it says, you know, is this for baked goods? Is it for ice creams? Right. You know, you could just say medical foods, just medical foods.
Okay. So there's not a specific population.
It's like animal foods. Animals eat one thing. They don't have, cattle eat cattle feed. They don't eat, you know, 30 or 40 different categories like humans do, where humans will have ice cream, candy, baked goods, soups, and so on. Medical people that have medical food just have that one category of medical food.
Okay. All right, that's good to know. All right, this is the next question is, there is a DHA, EPA product in capsule form that is marketed as medical food for liver disease. How does that fit the regulatory definitions for medical foods? Does that make sense? Do you want to hear it again?
I know I heard it, but if you say it's for liver disease, that sounds an awful lot like a drug claim.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. So how do you market each medical food in foods for special dietary use? Internet, store shelves, and what notification is needed for FDA? I think we've touched on this, but let's get back to it.
If it's a GRAS product, of course, you can go through the GRAS notification process, but that isn't required by law. You could just market it without the GRAS notification process. And you could market it any way you pleased, just so long as there's no deception involved.
Okay. All right, thank you. Can medical food or food for special dietary use be sold for things like sarcophagia? Do you hear that? Sarcophagia. muscle loss due to disease process or wound healing?
That would probably, this is something you'd want to go in and see a consultant about, or the FDA. This may have be construed as being a drug.
Yeah, it sounds like it's getting to that category with disease prevention.
And you can only slice the salami so thin, and then FDA is going to call you on.
Okay, next question. If the GRAS regulation doesn't specify use in medical foods, can it be used in medical foods? So I think if the GRAS dossier doesn't specify medical food as a specific use, can it still be used as medical food?
There could be a couple of different takes on that question, but
Give us all.
well,
We have plenty of time. We have plenty of time, trust me.
the meter's running. If you've declared it for use as a medical food, yes, you could sell it as a medical food.
But if it did not,
If you did not, if FDA is not aware that you're going to sell it as a medical food, the labeling people might have some dispute with you.
okay.
So if you've not said it's a medical food, yet you are selling it as one, you're on your own.
But you can amend the GRAS dossier to show that there is a use for medical foods.
Oh, yes, most certainly.
Fantastic, I've been listening.
Glad to hear it.
Okay, now next question is, what would be the benefit to being classified as a medical food versus a supplement? Very broad one.
As a medical food, there's always a chance of Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement.
Oh,
And everybody likes free stuff. So there's a chance of, really boosting sales like this. But if you first sell it as a dietary supplement, you can't come back and sell it as a food. That's restricted under Section 912 of the FDA Additives Amendment of 2007.
okay. So if you were trying to do one of the two, you should do medical foods first, then move to dietary supplement.
Well, right,
Because it's a food.
because you can't go backwards.
Yeah.
If you start selling it as a dietary supplement, and there's a lot of people that have made this mistake and eventually cost them a lot of money. If you're selling it as a dietary supplement or as a drug, you can't call it a food. You're prohibited from doing so. But if you call it a food first, you can move over to the supplement column later.
I think a lot of this question, a lot has to do with claims. Is there any type of claims you can make for a medical food?
Yes, you can make all the claims you want to, just so you can prove them.
Okay, so health claims, is that something you can do? Or is that
Health claim reduces the incidence of.
Mhm.
All right, so if you've already got an inborn error of metabolism, this material isn't going to reduce the incidence of an inborn error of metabolism.
Okay. So I think that's the biggest distinction between a lot of these people. They're asking, oh, should we do dietary supplements so we can have a structure function claim? Or are there any benefits that we can say for a medical food? So appreciate the clarification. Okay, so this is another question of clarification. I think it's building on some of the previous answers we've given. Are you saying that if the GRAS regulation doesn't specify use in a particular category, for example, beverages, it can't be used in medical foods beverage?
No, not at all.
So
If you want to say it's available in, say, beverages or ice cream or baked goods, that doesn't preclude you using it as a medical food. Now, medical food is most often a beverage. So you could say medical food as beverage. You probably wouldn't want to use it as, I don't think I've seen a medical food used in, say, a baked good.
I think I get it. All right, and now we're getting to some of the questions we've prepared. Is what instances should a company consider pursuing medical food status? I guess it's almost like advantages. What are advantages, and what scenario would it be more advantageous to specifically go for medical food status?
Well, if you went as medical food status, there's always a possibility of getting a reimbursement through Medicare and Medicaid.
The manufacturer or the people purchasing?
Well, the person purchasing it.
Okay, so that is a draw, marketing draw
Yeah.
for them. Okay,
Because essentially it would be free.
that's great.
That can be the question one more time.
Okay. What instances should a company consider pursuing medical food status? It's just
There's a provision of the regulation and supplemented by other material you can get from FDA, that if you pursue something under the Orphan Drug Act, that is, you produce a food or a drug for a group of people that is fairly low in number. I think it's like 1 in 100,000. You can get certain incentives from the FDA such that the next time you develop a drug, you could be moved up in the queue for review of that drug. It's like establishing credits to jump the line.
if they decide to take it further and try to get drugs.
If they actually come out with a medical food or an orphan drug, a food for an orphan disease or a drug for an orphan disease, there's incentives that allow you to get certain favors or privileges from the FDA for doing so.
Okay. And I guess a follow-up question to that is, you mentioned that if you just have consumption category for a medical food in a grass, like you state that as an intended use, you can use that as a medical food, right?
Right.
So would you advise many people writing a grass to also include medical food status as a possible, revenue source, a different product source? Is that a possible strategy to help some of these manufacturers diversify their products?
That's certainly a possibility.
So there's not much.
But you're still going to probably run into the labeling people that will say, gee, is this a real claim? Is this a real effect? And they may ask you to prove that.
So substantiating that claim is your
you have to substantiate the fact that it works as a medical food, that it is a medical food.
So when you get into that kind of substantiation, what do you need to substantiate a medical food claim?
They may, it all depends on what you can negotiate with the FDA.
Okay.
They are not unreasonable people.
Not clinical.
You may have to do a clinical study.
Okay.
But I would make sure the clinical study was exempt and won't be counted as an IND.
Okay. That's a fine line. Slice that salami really thin.
It's really nice to have something on paper there.
Okay. That's good. All right. Next question. What are the safety data considerations for medical food dossiers?
It's going to be the same as for anything else. Above all, the material is going to have to be safe. It's going to have to be produced in a facility that observes FSMA or HACCP. So there are certain incentives. And I believe medical foods are also must be produced in a facility that is licensed to produce medical foods.
Okay, so that's another consideration hurdle to produce medical foods. That's good to know. Okay, another question, and this kind of is building on a previous question. A question was answered saying that's a drug claim, but isn't that the beauty of medical food? If your IND is approved, then you can make a drug claim. Did that make sense?
If
that's how we received the question.
All right.
So we're reading it that way.
If this is a medical food or used as a food prior to getting an IND,
Starting with the food.
then you can move to a drug claim. You could move to a drug status, but you can't do the reverse.
Okay.
If you file an IND, this is in section 912 of the FDA Additives Amendment of 2007. That if you go as a food first, if you sell it or market it as a food first, you have the capability of making it a dietary supplement as well, or making it a drug, making it as a drug, usually at a higher dose. But if you get an IND, then, and there's a couple of exceptions here. If you get an IND, then it can't be used in food at all, or as a drug, or as a dietary supplement. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I hope that answers your question. If you want more clarification, please feel free to shoot it in the live chat. We're always looking to make sure we answer your specific question. But building on that, and I think I'm going to try to see if we can answer this person's question. I think he's really trying to ask, the type of medical food claims that you can make. Just really trying to understand maybe examples of the types of claims you can make.
Well, if you're making a medical food, if you're calling something a medical food, that's your claim. It's a medical food for what?
Okay, for a specific
Yeah.
disease or condition.
If it's a medical food that doesn't have something in it, which people have an inborn error of metabolism, they can't use it. They can't be exposed to it, right? That's your claim. Like for PKU people, if you have a medical food that has a very low amount of phenylalanine in it, then your claim is you will not have phenylketonuria or the toxicity resulting from phenylketonuria, resulting from the inability to metabolize phenylalanine. That's your claim.
I think we received another question or clarification comment from this attendee, and mentioning the FDA has published guidance that says an IND can be filed specifically for a medical food. That is not a drug.
Yeah, that's exemption.
Okay. All right. Okay, moving on to the next question. And once again, if you have a very unique situation, we're always available at info@burdockgroup.com. We can't answer everything off the top of our head. Dr. Burdock knows pretty much everything, not everything, 99.9%. So we might need to look up that 0.1% if you guys are asking us a question.
You have a lot of faith in me.
Oh, yeah. All right. Next question. Are there differences in approval time for a medical food and a grass ingredient? I guess there's kind of two answers to that.
It's going to go over to the on-plots people before
the labeling people.
Yeah, labeling people before FDA is or SAFSAN, the Office of Food Additive Safety, responds to your grass.
As part of the review process, on-plot would also be part of it to ensure medical food compliance.
Sometimes on-plots or OFAS, Office of Food Additive Safety, will have a non-objection, but they may say that on-plots may have some additional questions. But I believe something like a medical food might be submitted to on-plots before. But it all depends on who's running the show over at SAFSAN.
Okay. All right, we've gone through, I believe, 20 questions, and that was a lot. And now we're actually running into our last question. This is, once again, if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to us. But what constitutes reasonably obtained abstinence? For example, is gluten avoidance considered to be reasonably obtained with regular food for those with celiac?
Yes, it's on the label, or it's supposed to be on the label. It's like, and so it can be avoided. And same thing with diabetics. They're supposed to look at the total sugars involved. And so they can avoid those certain foods that are going to run them over their limit.
Okay. Well, any more questions? If not, thank you for your time, Dr. Burdock. We really appreciate taking time in your busy schedule and suiting up for us today. It's good to have you back in the office. And a big thank you to everyone who attended and submitted some fantastic questions. And once again, we'll do what we can to answer whatever hasn't been answered. And if you have any more specific questions, info@burdockgroup.com is the place to reach out. And other than that, we appreciate your time, and we hope that you can join us in November for our next webinar, which is going to be conducted by Dr. Julie Horton about plant-based proteins. Thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, sir.